I'd like to give you an introduction to what Beyond Budgeting is all about. And then I myself look very much forward to the rest of the day, because what you will also experience is a lot of great examples of companies that have put these principles into practice. And what you'll find is that what they've done is very different from company to company. But I really hope that will give you a lot of insights and inspiration so that you would like to start moving in your own organization. But to start with the start, let me say a little bit about our network, how it started. And actually it started here in the UK some 20 years ago, when a relatively traditional management network, leadership network, came together, and they discovered that they had the same problem in all of their organizations. They all had this massive process called the annual budget that they had to do once a year, and all of them felt that was a pain. But at that time, no one knew if there were alternatives. So that was the first task that our network took upon itself, was to find out, is it possible to run a big, complex organization without a traditional annual budget? And it took a bit of time in those days to find out, but it turned out that, yes, there were indeed alternatives. But what was even more interesting was that they then started looking into the performance of the companies that operated in this different way. And they found that the companies that operated without this traditional budget did much better. And then it began to become extremely interesting. So why was it? What was it that made performance so much better in companies that had abolished something that was there to improve performance in the first place? So that's pretty interesting. So this is what gives us, nourishment, and this is what gives us energy. Is this this fact that it is possible to get organizations to become more effective without the traditional tools and management tools. And what we really find is that not only are they more effective, but they also typically use much less efforts in operating the companies. So this is something that we've been focusing on. We've been writing about it. We're doing courses about this. We do consulting on this stuff and help companies on the journey. By now we have a fairly extensive network around the world. So this is not just something that a few companies are doing and working on. This is something that has been going on for many years. It's unfortunately not yet the common practice, but that is what we're aiming at. We really hope that someday, maybe in our lifetime, I'm not quite sure, but someday that this will be the way that companies are managed in the future. So a lot of great stuff is going on out there, and you'll hear some exciting stories here today. And let me take you one step further, and I'm not going to go through this in detail, but this is how we've decided to kind of summarize and frame these issues. We have developed what we call the 12 Beyond Budgeting principles, and this is our attempt at inspiring organizations to get this stuff in order. And they are also, by the way, in the small book that you have in front of you, and on our homepage. So they are many places. The idea with this, again, is to serve as inspiration when you start looking into this stuff. This is not a management recipe. This is not do this in this order. Again, it's meant as inspiration. And the thing is, we find that this stuff is extremely important. I mean, if you are not aligned on these elements, bad things happen, and you're not going to be able to have everyone running in the same direction with a high degree of efficiency. And it's not because managers or the people who decide companies, organizations have bad intentions. I mean, the budgets and a lot of the other stuff we have in our organizations are put in place, for good purpose, with good intentions. But the problem is that, despite this, I mean, bad things happen, because in most companies we find that people are not aware of this stuff. They are more focused on the strategy and the business model and other stuff, which is also important. But this stuff, we refer to it as the management model. I mean, the management model is as important. And we find companies in our network that have gained competitive advantage over their competitors, not because the strategy or the product is better, but because the management model is better. So, and one other message in the principles, without going through them in detail, is that on the left-hand side, we have what we refer to as the leadership principles, and the right-hand side, the management processes. And if you think about the left-hand side as the principles, the values, the purpose of the organization. And most companies, especially in our part of the world, more and more companies have, great statements about purpose and values and principles, and you'll have them on the walls in most companies. But what is very often missing is that the management processes that are in place do not support the principles. We say that we trust people, but in reality we don't. And people get frustrated, lose motivation, make bad decisions, and get maybe a bit cynical. We say we want to work as teams, and then HR, listens to best practice from consultants, and they install, individual bonuses and stupid things, which go counter to teamwork and what's good for the customers or whoever you're serving. And it's not to say that there's one way of doing things. In some organizations, I'm sure it's probably okay to have more control than in others. But if you do want to have an organization that is effective and that lives by its values and principles, I mean, these things have to hang together. That is one of the key elements of beyond budgeting, making sure that these things hang together, making sure that the leaders discuss their stuff. I had a great experience. I met recently with a CEO of a very large European-based global company recently, and he was pretty frustrated about them not being able to live their values and the principles in the company. They had this long legacy, nice statements of values and principles on the walls, and a true wish from him and his management team to live the values throughout this enormous global company. But he just had to realize that, that was really, really difficult, and the bigger they became, the more difficult it was. So I then showed him this picture and talked a bit about it, and he just clicked immediately. He said, of course. We're doing all this stuff over here, the management processes with professional HR people and professional finance guys and IT, and doing all this stuff that is regarded as best practice in isolation. But in combination, they go counter to the values and the principles, and maybe also, between the functional silos. So unless you are aware of that and start dismantling that or avoid that as you grow as a company, things are going to go wrong. You will end up as maybe a big company, but rather bureaucratic and not very efficient, and might not be able to keep all the bright people that thought it was interesting to work with you when you were a smaller and more interesting company to work for. So this is really, really important to think about. By the way, this exercise we just did, for those of you who are here with us tomorrow when we have the workshop, please remember to bring your scores or your paper, because we will go a little bit more in detail with that during the session tomorrow. So don't throw it away yet. In order to do this stuff, you have to be, some people will probably say, you have to be innovative. You have to be innovative about how you develop your company and how you manage. And some refer to this as management innovation, of course. But then there's a very interesting paradox about innovation. Because normally when we talk about innovation, people think about their strategy and their products, their services, their technology. And for most people, this is very, very exciting. People smile when they think about innovation. They would like their company to be innovative. They would like to be regarded as a first mover, leading edge, being able to attract, the top-notch, most innovative people. So this is really seen as something that is really, really great when it comes to technology. Do you recognize that? But when we start talking about management innovation, all of a sudden, especially the managers, are not so excited. It's a little bit more scary. Maybe because it comes closer to oneself. And I think also because we have so many beliefs about, what works and what doesn't work. And it's very difficult to have, especially the senior managers, get out of this, I don't know if I can call it a comfort zone, but the zone where they are. And this is really a bit of a paradox because, in both cases, it's about, getting better performance. So the purpose is exactly the same. But again, when we're over here, we always get these questions immediately. Well, in what's best practice? We're a company of 5,000 people, and we're this industry, and we're based in UK. What do others in our industry do? You would never get these kind of questions when you're in the technology space. You would want to, bypass your competitors and do something that's different than best practice. But when it comes to management innovation, unfortunately, people are insecure about what to put in place instead. And this is where we, of course, try and help with events such as these. Another interesting issue is that due to the fact that this is so interesting, everyone is, talking about this. This is a very crowded place. There's a lot of competition going on over here, obviously. But over here, not so much. This is much more, we'd call it blue ocean, I guess, as opposed to a red ocean space. So if you were really looking for a competitive advantage in your company, I would ask you to think more about your management model and spend some time on that. Or maybe a little bit less here, if you have to choose. Spend some time on this one. I think it'll be easier for you to outcompete your peers in that space. So again, it's about better performance, both of it. Another way of describing what Beyond Budgeting is all about is to think about it in this setting. When you think about, for example, the budget process and a lot of the things that we do in management, a lot of this was invented a long time ago. The budget process itself is, almost 100 years old. And a lot of the other stuff that we do and learn at business schools are things, again, that are not, are things that, have been invented by people 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. And we tend to continue working on the same tools and methods. Without thinking, well, when these processes were invented or designed, what were the circumstances at that point in time? And do we have exactly the same challenges and problems as they did at that time? And again, a lot of things have happened. When you think about, especially, I'm taking the budget as an example, things have changed enormously since the budget. Things change so fast. So we have a business environment today that is much more dynamic and hectic and ever-changing. Surely that must be something that we have to think about when we design our processes. And likewise, when it comes to, as Henry said before, theory X and theory Y, depending on where you are on that scale and how your company looks on your people, that should also have an impact on how you design your processes. So what we find in this lower left-hand corner is something that I'm sure has worked quite well at the time and was the right thing to do at that time. But seen with today's eyes, seem pretty rigid and out of date. And it's something that reinforces a old-fashioned command and control management style. With secrecy, sticks and carrots, to improve performance, which again, in my book, is a bit outdated and doesn't work very well especially in a theory Y environment. So, what we encourage you to do is to leave some of this behind. And start thinking more about, well, if we really are a theory Y company, or further to the right on this angle, you should start thinking about working more on values. And this is not to say that only values as opposed to rules-based management. Of course, as we just heard, in some companies, a lot of rules are needed for regulatory purposes and others. So it's not black or white, but more values-based management, providing more autonomy, showing trust to your people, being more transparent about what is going on so people have access to information and can make faster and better decisions. And tapping into what we refer to as the internal or intrinsic motivation, and not using the methods of the past. And likewise, when it comes to the processes, if your company or your organization is in a volatile environment, you have to work in a more dynamic way. Have to be able to respond to changes and react, and react when things happen that were not expected. When setting targets, for example, I mean, it doesn't make sense in my book to have a fixed target. We want to grow from 1,000 to 1,073 next year. If your environment is very dynamic, it's just a waste of time. And another example, I mean, how to evaluate performance, I mean, it must be a very more holistic way, rather than just counting the number of targets that you hit that were set, 1 or 2 years ago. And again, as I said, this is another way of framing or describing what beyond budgeting is about. It's about, making sure that your management processes take into account what kind of view on people do we have in our organization, how dynamic are we, what is our business rhythm, how fast do we need to react. Getting that right, finding the right balance, which will be different from company to company, as you'll also see today in the presentations. But finding your own path and your own balance is extremely important. And what we find is that companies become more agile, become more human, more interesting places to work, more efficient, less waste.
Repeat the question.
Yes, the question was, what do we mean with business rhythm? Well, the reason why we address that is we find that in almost any company, the rhythm of the business processes are so much linked to the calendar year or the fiscal year. Because we have to file a tax return and we have to file some accounts, and maybe some of you have to tell the shareholders, now and again about how things are going. So we use this as the default period for planning is this 1 year period. Again, just because we have to file a tax return and so forth. And of course, that has very much to do with the fact that the people who are designing the processes are people like myself, being finance guys. So for us, a 1 year period, is nice and neat and makes sense. But think about it, if you're in the oil industry and you're looking for oil on the Brazilian coast, I mean, your planning period is not 1 year. Or if you're a company that trades, financial products, I mean, maybe your business horizon looks 2 or 3 weeks ahead. I don't know. But I mean, what I'm saying is that the business horizon and the way you plan resources and stuff will vary enormously from a few days, weeks, to decades. There's a few companies where the annual year or the calendar year fits very well, and one of them is Lego. So that's one of they use with good reason the calendar year as their basis, because again, all the sales go out in November, December of the product. So for them, this 1 year planning makes a lot of sense. But for most other companies, the business rhythm, and think about your own company, has very little to do with the calendar year. So that's what we mean. Okay. So what we've then recommend is that you think deep and hard about, well, what are our planning needs in our company, and then do what you need, but no more than that. We find that when you have this annual mindset and you have your annual targets and you drill them down and you keep measuring if you're on track to reach the annual target throughout the year, I mean, you put so many processes in place that lead to so many stupid meetings and unnecessary waste and bad things really. So find out what works for you and what fits your industry. So As you can hear, I mean, beyond budgeting is about so much more than budgets. If you are here to hear about how to do a budget in a better way, I am very sorry to disappoint you deeply. But I will say a few words about the budget, though. And for those of you, again, who are with us tomorrow, we'll go into this in more depth tomorrow. Again, tomorrow's session is very much about, how do we then, start working without, and what do we put in place instead. Today is more about describing what it's all about. So tomorrow we'll spend some more time on a lot of the problems we have with budgeting, and that's a very long list. I'll just leave it up there for a few seconds for you to think about. But we really truly find that process is so important to do something about. Again, it doesn't solve everything to get rid of the budget, and it's not the only thing we should work on. But since the budget in many organizations is such a central part of all the performance management methodology in companies, doing something about the budget we find is a very good place to start. Of course, once you tackle that, you start a lot of great thinking about how things can be done differently, and which can then be passed on to other parts of the organization. Before I end, again, down with that, we're talking about the budget. Have you just spend a few minutes at your tables, 2-3 minutes maximum, think about why is it in your organizations that you do annual budgets? What is the purpose of the budget? What are you trying to achieve with the budget? Very briefly, when you start thinking about the budget, why is it that we do it in the first place? And you already came up very, very briefly with some of the main purposes of the budget. It's something about setting targets, giving direction where we're heading. It's something about having a financial plan for the coming year. And it's something about allocating resources. And all of these things are sensible things to do. They make sense. The problem we find is that we're doing it all in the same process. Because when you think about it, a target is something you like to see happen. It's something that's taking you to another level of performance than where you are today. Forecast is something about trying to predict where we're heading, to plan. And allocating resources is a third purpose. It's about who can spend what. So these are very different things. So our very, very brief recommendation to get out of this trap is to regard these things as different things and design different processes. So if we need targets, well, then design a target setting process, which could be a 1 year, or it could be a 10-year, or a 3-month. And forecast, well, make the forecast that you need to drive your business. No more, no less. And allocate resources when you need them, when you have full information about, what's the right thing to do. Because when this happens, you are able to improve each of these processes enormously and gain a lot of the benefits we talked about before, and make them more coherent also with your values. Anyway, during the day, you will see some examples of companies that have done this, and so you can let's come back to this and how this can work in practice. So on that note, I'd like to end for now, and I'm slightly over. I'm sorry, Henry. So that's it from me for now. Thank you.